In the summer of 1874, the city of St. Louis walked a circus elephant across a brand new bridge over the Mississippi. The thinking was simple. An elephant would never step onto a structure about to collapse, so if the elephant crossed, the bridge was sound. Then they ran 14 steam locomotives across it at once, and President Ulysses Grant came to open it to the nation. But the real danger that day had never been up on the deck. It sat more than 100 feet below everyone's feet, sealed inside a chamber of pressurized air, and it had already killed at least a dozen of the men who built the bridge. This is the story of the deadliest machine on the Eads Bridge, and it never crushed a single man. We start at the bottom of the river. Over the next half hour, we are going to climb down into the Mississippi with these workers, into a world of compressed air and candlelight, where the river was held back by nothing but pressure. We will meet the salvage diver, who had never built a bridge in his life, and somehow built the first great one made of steel. We will open up the machine that made it possible, a sealed iron chamber that let men dig on the bottom of a river without drowning. We will watch a sickness with no name begin to kill them, always after they came back up, never while they worked. We will meet the doctor who gave the disease to himself on purpose, just to understand it. And at the end, we will face the one question this channel will not fake an answer to, which is how many men this bridge actually killed. Stay with us, because almost nobody tells this story the way the records actually tell it. To understand the machine, we have to start with the man who trusted it, because he was not supposed to be building bridges at all. James Buchanan. Eads had no engineering degree. He had never built a bridge of any kind. What he had done, for most of his working life, was walk along the bottom of the Mississippi River. As a young man, Eads made his fortune in salvage. When steamboats sank in the muddy Mississippi, and in those years a great many of them did, someone had to go down into the water and bring up the cargo. Eads built himself a diving bell out of a whiskey barrel, weighted it, and had himself lowered into the current, breathing air pumped down from the surface, feeling his way blind across the river bottom for sunken crates and boilers and bars of lead. He did this again and again, in water so thick with mud that he worked entirely by touch, with the current dragging at him and wrecks shifting in the dark. It made him wealthy, and it made him something rarer than wealthy. It made him the one man in America who had spent years standing on the floor of the Mississippi. He learned what that riverbed was made of, how deep the sand ran before it reached rock, and how hard the water pushed against anything a man tried to sink into it. Then came the Civil War, and Eads did something that turned a local salvage man into a name the whole country knew. He promised the Union he could build a fleet of armored gunboats, ironclads, and do it fast. Most people thought it could not be done in the time he named. He built them anyway, a fleet of iron warships that helped the Union take control of the western rivers. So by the time St. Louis came looking for someone to bridge the Mississippi, James Eads was not just a rich diver with strange ideas. He was the man who had built the ironclads, and when he said he could do the impossible, the men who ran the city had learned to listen. And St. Louis was asking for the impossible. No bridge had ever crossed the Mississippi this far south. The river at St. Louis was wide, deep, and violent, choked with grinding ice in the winter, and swollen with brutal current in the spring, and the riverbed itself was a moving thing that shifted with every flood. To carry a bridge and the heavy trains that would run on it, the piers could not rest on sand, because sand would wash out from under them. They had to reach down to solid bedrock, and the bedrock was buried far below the water, under 100 feet and more of shifting river bottom. Every engineer who looked at the problem saw the same wall. You cannot build on sand that moves. You cannot dig a foundation underwater in a current that swallows steamboats whole. And you certainly cannot send men down 100 feet into a river and expect them to come back up alive. Eads looked at the same wall and made two decisions that the experts told him were reckless. The first was the bridge itself. He would build it out of steel, using true arches, at a time when steel was a new and half-trusted material, and almost nothing that large had ever been made of it. The railroads distrusted it. Critics said the arches could not carry the load and would come down. Eads not only insisted on the steel, he insisted on building the arches in a way no one had done at this scale. Rather than filling the river with a forest of timber supports and blocking the boats, he would build each arch outward from its pier, reaching toward the middle of the river from both sides at once. The steel held up from above until the two halves met in empty air over the water. It was daring, and it was watched by people waiting for it to fail. The second decision is the one that concerns us here, because it is the one that killed people. To reach the bedrock, Eads decided to send his men down to the bottom of the river inside sealed chambers of pressurized air. He would push the river back with nothing but pressure and let the workers dig on the dry riverbed 100 feet down, as if the Mississippi were not roaring directly over their heads. He had seen the idea used in Europe on a smaller scale. Almost no one in America had tried it this deep, and this is one of the most overlooked stories in the whole history of American building. So we spent weeks in the old records to tell it to you straight, because the machine he chose would go on to write a rule about the human body in the blood of the men who ran it. If you want the machines and the men that built the modern world told exactly this way, with the engineering left in and nothing invented, this is the channel that does it. Stay with us, because we are about to climb down inside that chamber, and the deepest, deadliest part of this story is still 100 feet under the river. So let us open the machine up and see how it worked, because on paper it is almost beautiful, and in practice it was a slow trap. The device was called a pneumatic caisson. Picture an enormous box built of iron and heavy timber, as large as a small building, turned upside down so that it was open at the bottom and sealed at the top. Workers built it at the surface and then slowly sank it, open mouth downward, onto the bed of the river. Now here is the part that made it work. From above, steam engines pumped compressed air down into the sealed box, and the pressure of that air pushed the river water back out through the open bottom. Inside the chamber, the riverbed sat exposed and almost dry, a small pocket of breathable air pressed down onto the very floor of the Mississippi. Men climbed down a long shaft through an airlock into that pocket, and there they dug. As the men dug the sand and gravel out from under the iron rim, the whole heavy chamber settled lower, deeper into the riverbed, chasing the bedrock down. The muck they loosened was carried up and out through shafts, some of it blown out under the pressure itself. Above the chamber, layer by layer, the great stone pier was built up toward the surface, and the caisson stayed pinned underneath it, buried alive on purpose, doing its work in the dark while a bridge grew on its back. This was among the largest such chambers ever sunk, pushed deeper into a riverbed than the method had ever been taken before. But there was a price hidden in the physics, and the price grew with every foot they went down. The deeper the chamber sank, the harder the river pushed against it, and so the more pressure the engines had to force into the air to hold the water out. Down at the East Pier, the air inside was pressed to roughly 50 pounds on every square inch, at a depth of around 95 feet below the surface. At the east abutment, they went deeper still, past 120 feet down. That was the deepest, highest pressure-compressed air work of its kind that had ever been attempted anywhere. The men in that chamber were breathing air crushed to several times the pressure their bodies were ever built to hold. There was no gauge on a human being to warn them how much of that pressure they were storing up with every breath they took. Life inside the Caisson was its own strange world, and the old accounts of these chambers still read like reports from another planet. The air was hot and thick and heavy, hard to move through and hard to breathe. Candle flames burned short and strange in the dense atmosphere. Men's voices came out high and pinched and wrong. A pipe would not draw properly. Fresh coffee brought down from the surface turned flat and strange under the pressure. A whistle came out thin. The heat pressed on the men like a wet blanket, and sweat ran off them as they swung their picks at the packed sand and gravel of the ancient riverbed. Every shift began and ended at the airlock, that iron door where the pressure was slowly raised or lowered to let a man pass between the crushing world at the bottom and the ordinary world above. To go down, the lock was sealed and the pressure brought up until it matched the chamber, and a man's ears and sinuses screamed against it. To come up, the same door bled the pressure away. Hundreds of laborers rotated through these chambers in shifts, digging in the gloom on the floor of the Mississippi, sending the river bottom up bucket by bucket, most of them immigrant workers, many of them Irish and German, glad of the pay, and with little idea of what the pressure was quietly doing to them. And the pressure carried its own immediate dangers, quite apart from the sickness that came later. If the seal ever failed, and the air rushed out, the river above could come crashing in, and a sudden loss of pressure could rupture a man's ears or worse. As the chambers were driven deeper and the pressure was forced higher, the shifts themselves were cut shorter and shorter, until the men at the very bottom could only stay down for a short spell before they had to be brought up again. Nobody yet understood that it was that trip up, not the length of the shift, that truly mattered. And here is the strange, cruel heart of the whole story. Down in that chamber, doing the work, the men were mostly fine. The machine did not crush them, it did not drown them, and it did not drop anything on them. The Caisson, the deadliest machine on this bridge, killed almost no one while they were actually inside it. It killed them after they climbed the ladder and stepped back out into the daylight, safe, on dry land, with the day's work behind them. The first man died on the 19th of March in 1870. He had finished a shift of about 2 hours down in the pressurized chamber. He climbed out through the airlock, back up into the ordinary air, and by every account, he felt perfectly well. 15 minutes later, he was dead, and not one doctor in the city of St. Louis could tell you why. We should stop here and be honest about something, because this channel does not paper over the gaps in the record. Even the name of that first man is not settled. One careful medical history of the project records him as a worker named Riley. Another account of the first documented death of this kind in America, on that very same date, names an Irish-born laborer called Moran. We are not going to pretend to you that we know for certain which name belongs to that first grave. The records disagree, and we would rather tell you plainly that they disagree than invent a certainty that was never there. What is certain is that he was only the first. As the caissons went deeper and the pressure climbed higher, more and more men began to fall. And the pattern was always the same, and always backwards from what anyone expected. A man would work his shift at the bottom without any trouble at all. He would come up through the lock, and then, sometimes minutes and sometimes hours later, standing on solid ground far from the river bottom, the sickness would take him. His joints would seize. A deep tearing pain would twist through his knees and his shoulders and his belly. His legs would stop answering him. Some men were left paralyzed. Some men were left crippled for the rest of their lives. And some men simply died, up in the fresh open air, for reasons no physician of that day could name. It was so far outside anything the doctors understood that the symptoms were often misread entirely. A man staggering and bent as he came off the airlock, unable to walk straight, could be taken for drunk or lazy rather than dying. And the terror of it spread through the workforce because there was no way to see it coming and no way to fight it. The danger was invisible. It did not live down in the dark chamber where you could face it and brace against it. It waited until you believed you were safe. It followed you up the ladder and out into the sunshine and struck you down in the one place nothing was supposed to be able to reach you. And still the men came back to the airlock the next morning. Work was scarce, and the pay in the chambers was better than most of them could find anywhere else. And a man with a family to feed will gamble against an enemy he cannot even see. Some of them surely told themselves it only happened to the weak, or the careless, or the other fellow. They lined up, and they went back down, and the river bottom took its share of them week after week. Today we know exactly what was happening, and it is worth understanding, because it is the whole engine of the tragedy. Under all that pressure at the bottom of the river, the men's blood and tissue soaked up gas from the compressed air they were breathing, far more of it than a body ever holds at the surface. That by itself did no harm, as long as it stayed dissolved. The harm came from speed. When a man rose too quickly through the airlock and the pressure around him fell away in a matter of minutes. That stored gas came fizzing out of his blood the way bubbles rush out of a bottle the instant the cap is cracked. The bubbles gathered in his joints, in his spine, in his brain. That is what locked the joints. That is what stopped the legs. In the worst cases, that is what stopped the man's heart and his breathing altogether. And the reason it stayed hidden for so long is almost simple. The cause and the harm were separated by time. A man was hurt down in the chamber, but he did not feel it there. He felt it later, up in the open air, doing something else entirely, far from the pressure that had actually done the damage. To the doctors of the day, the chamber looked innocent, because nobody fell ill inside it. The killer had a head start of an hour, and it used it. Nobody knew any of that yet. The mechanism was a complete mystery. And because the men who were struck so often walked hunched and bent at the waist, unable to straighten up, someone gave the affliction a bitter nickname borrowed from a fashionable stooped posture of the day, a way of walking called the Grecian bend. The workers, folded over in pain, were said to have the bends. That name has followed the disease from that river bottom in St. Louis all the way into modern diving and modern medicine. We should be fair about the history here, because the very same nickname is sometimes credited instead to the men working under another famous bridge in these same years. But many accounts trace the word to these workers on this project, bent double on the banks of the Mississippi. Either way, a brand new way of dying had earned itself a name, and by most tellings, it earned that name right here. A documentary like this one takes us weeks of work, digging through coroner's findings, old engineering journals, and medical papers most people have never opened or just to separate what really happened from the legends that grew up around it. If you want to help us keep making them, there is a link to buy us a coffee down in the description. Every small bit of support keeps this channel digging, and we are grateful for every bit of it. Now, in the middle of all this DIing, One man decided to do something almost no one else on Earth would dare. And this is the part of the story that stays with you long after the rest. Eads had hired a personal physician for the project, a doctor named Alphonse Jaminet, and put him in charge of the health of the men in the chambers. Jaminet did something for those workers that was genuinely ahead of its time. He set up a floating hospital, a barge moored on the river right beside the work, so that a man who came up sick could be treated within minutes instead of being hauled all the way across the city while the bubbles did their damage. It was one of the earliest on-the-job medical stations in all of American industry. He laid down rules for the men, too. He ordered that after every shift they were to stay under his eye for at least an hour before going home, and he had them drink 3/4 of a pint of strong, hot beef tea, trying to keep their strength up against a thing he could not yet name. But Jaminet had a problem that no amount of care and no amount of beef tea could fix. He did not understand the disease because nobody in the world understood it. So he decided to study it in the only laboratory he fully trusted, which was his own body. Jaminet had himself sealed into the chamber and taken all the way down to the deepest part of the work. He stayed there under approximately 45 pounds of pressure for about 3 hours, longer than a normal shift for the men. Then he had himself brought back up. He rose something like 95 feet in under 4 minutes, which we now know to be dangerously, recklessly fast. Exactly the kind of ascent that was killing his patients. For a little while at the top, he felt fine. Then, within about 45 minutes, it came for him. Both of his legs and one of his arms went numb, and then useless. The doctor in charge of the men's health was partly paralyzed on the riverbank by the very sickness he was trying to defeat. And here is the remarkable thing about the man. Instead of only suffering through it, he observed it. Jaminet wrote down what was happening to his own failing body in careful clinical detail. The numbness, the paralysis, the slow and frightening recovery, and what he left behind is considered one of the first clear, personal medical descriptions of decompression sickness ever set down on paper. He turned his own paralysis into a scientific record. He noted how long it took each limb to fail, how the feeling crept back in over hours and days, and how close he had come to not recovering at all. Few doctors before or since have been willing to nearly kill themselves to describe a disease from the inside. But now we come to the tragedy folded inside the courage, and it is a hard one to sit with. Jaminet came out of that experiment with the wrong answer. He came to believe the danger came mainly from the exhaustion of the labor and from descending too quickly into the pressure. He blamed the trip down. He did not grasp that the true killer was the trip up, the coming back to the surface too fast, the gas tearing out of the blood as the pressure dropped. And so the rule he wrote for how slowly the men ought to be brought up was still far, far too fast to keep them safe. His science was brave, and his science was wrong. And because it was wrong, his floating hospital and his beef tea and his careful hour of rest could not stop the dying. The men kept coming up too quickly because the one man in charge of their safety did not yet understand that this, precisely this, was the thing that was killing them. The real cure, slow and patient decompression, carried out over a long climb, would not be properly worked out for years to come. If your own family worked jobs like these, down on the rivers, out on the high steel, or deep underground, we would truly love to hear about it in the comments. Those first-hand family stories are worth more than anything sitting in an archive, and this community has turned up things over the months that never made it into a single history book. And yet, through all of it, the bridge went up. Foot by foot, the piers climbed up out of the river toward the light. The great steel arches reached out across the water and met in the middle, in empty air over the Mississippi, exactly as Eads had promised, and exactly as the experts had sworn they could not. Even that final meeting nearly beat them, when the last piece of the closing arch would not fit because the summer heat had swelled the steel just enough to jam it. The crews packed the ribs of the arch in tons of ice to shrink the metal back down, cooling it degree by degree until the closing section could at last be dropped into its place. The bridge was finished, in the end, with steel and nerve and a mountain of ice. And on the 4th of July, in 1874, the city of St. Louis threw open the Eads Bridge with a celebration worthy of the impossible thing it was. Which brings us right back to where we began, up on the deck, in the sunshine. They walked that circus elephant out onto the span, because people still half believed a heavy animal had some instinct that would make it refuse to step onto an unsound bridge, and the elephant strolled across without a care. They lined up 14 steam locomotives and ran them all out onto the bridge at once, a deliberate crushing test of the new steel, and the steel held. President Ulysses Grant came to St. Louis, and the crowds roared, and the first bridge ever to conquer the Mississippi at that city, and the first great bridge of steel anywhere on earth, belonged to the ages. That is the triumph. Now here is the ledger written underneath it, and this is the question we promised at the start that we would not dodge. How many men did the machine kill to make that shining day possible? And the honest answer is that we do not fully know, and anyone who hands you one clean number is guessing. The National Engineering Society that honors the bridge has stated that 14 men died of Caisson disease. The Park Service record puts the toll at 15 dead, with 2 more men crippled for the rest of their lives, and dozens more badly hurt. A careful modern medical review of the project counted the deaths at 13, with around 30 men hospitalized. And one of the early records out of the world of diving medicine lists the fatalities at 12, among something like 350 compressed air workers who passed through that job. So which is it? 12, 13, 14, or 15? The truth is that the disagreement itself is the real story, and it is worth sitting with. Back then, no one was keeping the kind of careful, honest count we would demand today. It was hard even to agree on who should be counted as a victim. Did you count only the men who died right there at the worksite, or also the men who were carried home crippled and died weeks later of what the Caisson had done to them? Did you count the ones who simply drifted away, sick and broken and unable to work, and were never heard from again? By many accounts, roughly a quarter of the entire workforce in those chambers suffered from the disease in some form or other. Whichever fatal number you settle on, it sits on top of a much larger crowd of the wounded. That is not a handful. That is a quarter of everyone who went down into the pressure, coming back up damaged in one degree or another, from a stiff and aching evening all the way to a grave. The exact number of graves is blurred by poor record-keeping and by an age that did not think a common laborer's death was worth writing down with any care. We would rather stand here and tell you plainly that the number is uncertain than hand you a tidy figure the record simply cannot support. On this channel, an honest gap in the history will always beat a confident guess. What is not uncertain is the meaning of those graves, the lesson that was bought with those men's lives, that pressure has to be released from the human body slowly and patiently, was written here in blood before anyone alive knew how to read it. And because it could not yet be read, the same invisible killer was already waiting just a few years down the road, under the towers of the Brooklyn Bridge, where it would strike down worker after worker and leave that bridge's own chief engineer a broken man who watched the rest of the work through a bedroom window. The machine that built the Eads Bridge did not stay at the Eads Bridge. It carried its lesson and its death toll straight on or into the next great bridge in America. And the Eads Bridge itself still stands. More than 150 years after that elephant walked across it, the first great steel bridge in the world is still there, still carrying traffic over the Mississippi at St. Louis, its arches as sound as the day Grant opened them. Millions of people have crossed it without ever once knowing that the piers beneath their wheels were dug by men breathing crushed air 100 feet down in the dark, or that the price of those piers was counted in a number the history books still cannot agree on. Eads himself went on from this bridge to tame the mouth of the Mississippi itself, designing a system of jetties that scoured the shipping channel deep enough for ocean vessels, and his name was carried by the bridge long after the men who dug its foundations were forgotten. That is the quiet cruelty in almost every one of these stories. We remember the man whose name is on the bridge, and we lose the names of the men who died 100 feet beneath it. A few of their names did survive, snagged in a coroner's note or a doctor's paper here and there, arguing with each other across the decades, as we have seen. But most of them are simply gone. They were the men who dug in the crushed air at the bottom of the Mississippi so that trains could roll dry above the river, and when the sickness took them, the record barely paused. This video is, in a small way, the marker most of them never got. So if nothing else sticks with you from all of this, let it be them, and not just the arches over their heads. So the next time you see a great bridge, and try to imagine the danger of building it, remember the Eads Bridge, and remember that its deadliest machine was never up on the high steel where you would think to look for it. It was down in the dark, in the pressurized air at the very bottom of a river, and it killed men only after it had let them believe they were finally safe. The workers who dug those foundations could stand up under the whole crushing weight of the Mississippi over their heads. The one thing they could not survive was coming back up too fast into the light. If this is the kind of history you want, the real machines and the real men who built the modern world with the engineering left in and nothing made up, then subscribe and stay with us. We put out another forgotten machine and another untold story every single week. Thank you for watching, and we will see you on the next one.